Thank you. So in many ways, I think I'm just going to be repeating what Bronwyn and Deb have already said, but hopefully can add a little bit more to it, particularly by sharing with you some of the research that we've done with children. It's a real honour to be here today, so thank you for the opportunity. And I just want to say thank you to the Centre, to the Treating Families Fairly Network, and to Uniting Care and to everyone in Stirling for the amazing work that you do day in, day out. We are on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people. I live and work in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. The research that I'm going to be sharing with you today is taking place on Yorta Yorta lands and in Utuita, Tasmania, on the lands of the Palawa people, all unceded lands. I pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today, and to elders past, present, and to the incredible emerging leaders that we have around us. And I especially want to give my gratitude to those extraordinary Indigenous leaders who led the Yes campaign and, regardless of the result, have contributed so much to our country. I just wanted to thank on the screen you see before you the people who were involved in this research project, just a thanks to all of them, particularly to Family Care and to Bernie Works, who are our partners in this research. David Tennant is here. You keep hearing about David and all the extraordinary things that David does. I did just want to make a couple of comments around the referendum before we start. And in some ways, the acknowledgement of country that I gave felt somewhat hollow to me as a result of the result on Saturday. And yet, I think it's even more important than ever that we really reflect on what that acknowledgement means. I'm cognizant of the fact that that our Indigenous leaders have called for a week of silence this week, and I'm deeply respectful of that. And in that context, I do think it's crucial for non-Indigenous people to step up, to show solidarity and love, and to shoulder as much of the burden as we can, because the pain of so many of our loved, respected and admired Indigenous colleagues is really deep at the moment. And I wanted to just make two comments. Just the image that you see on the screen was drawn by a 7-year-old boy who took part in our research. He was drawing about the things that really matter to him. He drew a whole series of flags that were so important to him. And I just wanted to make two comments. First, as reflections and dissections of what has happened unfolds, I think we will be in a very bad place as a country if we criticise political leaders for being too ambitious in their pursuit of social justice. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And second, the Uluru Statement is, I think, perhaps more important than ever. It reminds us of what we all owe to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. It reminds us how deeply those children are loved by their communities, by their families. And it reminds us that while we as a nation have rejected the gift that is the Uluru Statement, those of us who believe in justice must work to make real the dream that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children can walk in two countries and are treasured and nurtured in each. And the Uluru Statement speaks of Makarrata, of coming together after a struggle. And that deep wisdom, the wisdom of 65,000 years, may give us a path forward. So today, I wanted to focus on the two questions that are at the heart of the conversation that we're having. Why does Australia continue to accept child poverty, and what can be done about it? But at the outset, I'm going to just pose a third question. Do we know what child poverty is? And I think the immediate response to that third question is, well, yes, of course we know. And I think everyone in this room and online probably has a clear answer, yes. And yet the answer isn't always straightforward. We don't have an agreed definition of child poverty in Australia, not an official agreed definition. In fact, we don't have an official agreed definition on poverty in Australia. We use a range of different definitions, most notably the Henderson Poverty Line and the OECD definition, which is 50% or below 50% median income. And I'll be using that definition a bit throughout this talk. And of course, it is really hard to fix something, to reduce it or to end it when we don't know exactly what it is. And here I just added the work that we're doing with children doesn't actually use language of poverty and child poverty. And because that language of poverty carries such stigma. So we talk to children about doing it tough when times are hard. We also use the language not of reducing child poverty, but by ending child poverty. And the reason we use the language of ending child poverty is a very subjective one. We work with children, we hear their stories, we share their hopes and their dreams and also their fears and their pain. And if we settle for the aim of reducing child poverty, some children remain in poverty by definition. And I couldn't possibly imagine which of those gorgeous children that we work with and whose stories we hear should be left in poverty. And so we use the language of ending child poverty. And I don't think that's a pipe dream in a country that is as wealthy as this one. So while we might not have an official definition of child poverty, children talk very clearly about what it is. And put simply, as many children have told us, being poor sucks. But poverty is also about despair. In the research that we do with children, we invite them to write or to draw messages to adults who make decisions that affect children. One 10-year-old girl wrote, "Dear Prime Minister Anthony, can you please give children with no opportunity some hope?" When we talk with children, as I said, we don't use those words of poverty because they carry so much stigma. And we often use the language of life being tough. When Max described what life is like when it's tough, when childhood is shaped by poverty, this is how he described it. He talked about anger, about being heartbroken. He said it feels like pain is in the air. He described how poverty hurts. It hurts inside. And that devastation is everywhere. You can see it in people's eyes. Max and his family were experiencing homelessness when he said this. Experiencing homelessness for Max and his brothers and sisters and his mum, this is a single parent family, meant fear, a lack of safety, a lack of material comfort and despair. And they lived in what we call food insecurity. So what that meant was that Max was almost always hungry and his mum constantly worried about where the next meal was coming from. Any activities that Max and his siblings engaged in would cost money, as Bronwyn has said. And that meant there was more pressure on his mum about where the next meal would come from. Things got even harder. Often Max just didn't ask because he wanted to protect his mum. We do need a definition of poverty and of child poverty. We do need to be clear about what it is. But I think few definitions will be more powerful than Max's explanation. It feels like pain is in the air. So why does Australia continue to accept child poverty and what can be done? Well, I just wanted to share a little bit of that history with you, looking at it. Bob Hawke did say in the context of an election campaign in 1987 that no Australian child will be living in poverty by 1990. Hawke diverted somewhat from his written script. What he meant, what was written in his script, was that no child should live in poverty. It was a small but important distinction, and Hawke's pledge certainly sounds stronger. And since that pledge, there's been a lot of cynicism about the comment, and it's often become the butt of jokes. And yet, during the Hawke-Keating years, child poverty did decline significantly. This is something that we often forget. And one of the points that I want to make today is that whether or not we have high levels of child poverty in this very wealthy country is a political choice. And our history shows that something can be done. So in the lead up to Hawke's promise and following, things did change. From 1982 to 1996, there was a continual decline in child poverty, both before and after housing costs. By the late 1990s, Australia was regarded internationally as having made significant progress in dealing with child poverty, and we were emerging as a global leader in addressing child poverty. That's quite remarkable. That was done through a range of initiatives, through a more generous approach to allowances and tax benefits, supplements for low-income families to meet the cost of living, increasing family payments and linking those payments to wage growth, rent assistance for low-income families, and reforms around child support all played an important role in that downward trend that we saw. And child poverty, based on that definition that I gave earlier, continued to decline from the late 1990s till around 2003, 2004, and then it began to rise again and rose sharply to 18% in 2007, and it stayed at about that level. The rise in child poverty resulted largely from lower benefits and from conditionality imposed on sole parents in particular. Child poverty rates for households relying on government allowances rose from 25% in 1993 to 66% in 2017. For the decade from 2009, child poverty has remained at just under 18%. And as my colleague from the Crawford School, Peter Whiteford, has pointed out, and he made this comment in 2007, for the past 2017, I should say, for the past 12 years, governments under 5 different prime ministers, both coalition and Labor, have made decisions that severely impacted on poverty and particularly impacted on low-income single families, and that's generally low-income single mum families. And everyone in this room will have heard, as we have heard in our research, what it meant when eligibility for single parent payment was at the age of 8. 8 is very, very young. The recent change to single parent payment and the increase in eligibility to 14 is really significant. And we're hearing already that people feel that's going to have a really positive impact on their lives. So all of these things are about policy choices. And we can decide, or we have a great deal of control over, the level of child poverty and the depth of child poverty that we're prepared to live with. I won't go into this slide in any detail. Deb did a lovely job, and everyone here, I think, knows what happened during COVID. But what we really saw there was what we might even call a natural experiment. We saw what can happen when we increase benefits, policy choices. So we do know that there are ways of reducing child poverty. The Hawke Keating reforms didn't end child poverty, but they did begin to move us in the right direction. So why then as a nation do we continue to accept it? I think there are many, many reasons, but my research suggests 2 are particularly important. First, we don't, as a society, as communities, listen to children. I'm convinced that if most Australians who are not experiencing poverty heard children's stories, as my colleagues and I would not tolerate child poverty. A 10-year-old girl asking the Prime Minister to provide children with no opportunity, some hope. A 7-year-old child, or we've heard several 7-year-old children, explained that toys are nice to have, but the priority for them is food and housing. And the pain described by Max. All of these experiences we're able to ignore when we don't listen to children. I don't think we would or we could continue to accept child poverty if we genuinely listen to children's experiences. And second, we've already talked a little about this. The shifts in policies from 2006 that saw that upward trend in child poverty were accompanied by a narrative of blaming individuals and of talking about the experience of poverty in ways that were dehumanising and stigmatising and designed to shame. And those narratives have done their job. We still don't see, as Bronwyn pointed out, poverty as a structural problem or as a symptom of systems that are failing those who need support, but rather we've been encouraged to see it as the fault of those who experience poverty. Those narratives, as I said, have done their job and they've done their damage. One mum that I spoke with joy of her adored 8-year-old child, and she spoke of being able to give her so little of what she needs, of being short of food, of the fear of homelessness, of insecurity. And she said in despair, I sometimes wonder if she wouldn't be better off in foster care. But the one thing that stops me is that I know that no one can love her the way I love her. And then she said, and at this point, she's in tears, we're both in tears. She said, I'm not a leaner, I just need a little bit of help. Then Treasurer Joe Hockey made that infamous lifters and lenders comment in his 2014 budget speech. Almost a decade later, those words were still causing people pain. And they've been reinforced by language of handouts and other glib statements that some political leaders have thought might have increased their electoral mileage or might have garnered support for policies that exacerbate poverty and hurt those experiencing it. Okay, you have to just like talking about it. Thank you. So what then can be done so that we no longer accept child poverty? So the first thing that we need to do is to listen to children and to act on what they tell us. And we need to transform narratives. And importantly, hopefully, the narratives have changed over these past 12 or 18 months. Very different language is now being used by federal governments, and this really matters. We need to recognise and applaud that shift, and we need to say very clearly that we won't accept it when our political leaders blame and shame those who are experiencing poverty. Based on our research with children who are growing up in contexts of poverty, there are also, I think, a few more things that we can do as well. And much of that is around recognising the structural and also the multidimensional nature of poverty, and child poverty in particular. We'll jump on to the next one, okay, thank you. So to end child poverty, we do, I would suggest, need to define it. I'll just keep going as slides will catch up. Over the past year or so, we've worked with over 100 children in 2 communities, one in Victoria, one in Tasmania. And this is qualitative work using participatory methods. So we hear very deeply what are the things that really matter to children. The children and young people who participated in our research are aged between 6 and 12 or 13 years. And some of the children, thanks Patty, some of the children have ranged up to 16 years, but that group 6 to 12 or 13 is the group that we're focusing on. And that's the group of middle childhood where we see a policy cliff, where children are most likely to be missing. So based on what children have told us, we have this working definition of child poverty. And I say working definition because the research is ongoing. We may change it at the margins, but we think this is getting close and we'd really love to hear your feedback. What's important about this definition is that it's multidimensional. It's about the interplay between material and non-material deprivations. Poverty means that children don't have the material basics. It also, and that's fundamentally bound up with income. It also means that they don't have opportunities, that those opportunities are limited and their relationships suffer, or they're not in place, or they're under incredible pressure because of poverty. And from this definition, we've developed the MORE framework, M-O-R, we can jump onto the next slide. The MORE framework for understanding poverty in a way that's child-centred and as a means of assessing it, but most significantly responding. So the MORE framework has 3 dimensions. The material dimension is about money and material resources, but it's also about adequate and essential infrastructure. And this is important because many things are not accessible, even if incomes rise modestly. So public goods and social infrastructure are really important and need to be seen as collective, not individual. We have the opportunity dimension, and we begin here with child-inclusive communities and child-friendly services. Where do we begin? Listening is not a bad place there. These are the essential elements that are needed to ensure that children have positive experiences that enhance the quality of life now and ongoing development into the future. And the relational dimension, the 3rd dimension, is of fundamental importance to children. Loving and caring relationships can buffer and protect children, but poverty eats away at those relationships. In this dimension, we have the structural factors that are needed to foster strong and supportive relationships, and also the policies and systems that we need to do that. And we've also included here, based on what children have told us, the importance of having a trusted network of caring adults and supportive adult behaviours. And I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of what children have said about each of these dimensions. Okay. So in talking about material deprivation, very common themes are around not having enough to eat and being hungry, housing insecurity, and for some children, homelessness. The cost of petrol is a major issue for children because of what that means. Because as a result, children can't go places, they can't do things. And that's intensified when there's no public transport, which takes us to the importance of infrastructure. We hear about children limiting what they're asked for and narrowing their lives because of material poverty. As I said earlier, children differentiate between wants and needs, and toys are commonly described as wants. A 10-year-old girl said, toys are not important, but if we can give the parents some money, then they can get water and food and a little bit of toys. But mainly the important things like food, water, a bed and a toilet. And you might wonder about the reference to a toilet here. For children experiencing homelessness, not having a toilet is a daily indignity, and it is a major safety issue. The opportunity dimension, or in the opportunity dimension, we're hearing a great deal about schools. Children talk about the wonderful, positive difference that kind, caring teachers make in their lives, but they describe a system that's broken. One boy described wanting a teacher age to work with him one-on-one because he's really struggling to read or write. He's just started high school, he can't read, and he knows that there's no possibility of him getting any help because, as he said, my school doesn't do one-on-one help. They don't even have enough teachers as it is. We hear a lot about violence, about fights and about bullying, and we also hear about the anxiety that many children are feeling about going to school. Children have also spoken about services that are not child-friendly. Medical care in particular is often not available to children and their families, either because the costs are too high or because in some communities it just isn't there. One girl explained needing braces and her mum now having to work 3 jobs. This is the point that you made, Deb. Her mum having to work 3 jobs to save up for them. This 9-year-old girl felt incredibly guilty because her mum has to work so hard, and she said she misses seeing her because she almost never sees her now. An 11-year-old boy described his doctors ignoring his concerns when he needed surgery. He described that as scary, almost traumatising. He also didn't know when he'd get surgery because cost was such an issue. And many children described feeling that there was no one to help them or their families. Isolation is a real feature of children's lives. Go on to the next slide. Some of the teenagers who participated in this research, sort of 13, 14, 15-year-olds, and here particularly the 15-year-olds, talk about working really long hours, about having no time for any activities apart from school, work, home and sleep. This is not work for pocket money. This is work that's urgently needed for children to be able to support their families. And so positive experiences of life now and development for future opportunities are being seriously undermined. And children also talk about their worries for the future, their fear that their lives will be characterised by the hardship that they and their parents are now experiencing. And of course, if we continue to accept child poverty and we fail to act, those fears will be realised. And children talked a great deal about the pressure placed on relationships when the people they love most are under incredible stress because of poverty. They talked about parents getting angry and sad. You can see from the quotes here how children often talked about parents fighting and arguing or grumping at them because of the pressure that poverty was placing them under. Go on to the next slide, please. One boy described his experience of going with his mum to a charity to ask for food, and his mum separately shared this same story. He and his mum were told that she was coming too often and she'd better have a good reason for coming back. So we don't know what was happening there. Maybe it was one person having a really bad day. Maybe it was a charity under enormous pressure and not having food. But the impact on this boy was devastating. He was shattered by the way his mum had been treated. He said his mum was angry. She'd already been crying that day, and the way she was treated made everything worse. He struggled to understand why no one cared. So for him, it was his personal relationships with the relationships with the world around him. Not each of these dimensions in and of themselves necessarily indicate poverty, except the material dimension, which is closely related to income poverty. But when they overlap, we see multidimensional poverty, and often very deep multidimensional poverty. And the framework helps us to understand that poverty is indeed multidimensional. That's the way children talk about it. Increasing household income is essential in ending child poverty, but it may not be enough in and of itself. It's a good start, but it may not be enough in and of itself. But we can flip all of this around and say when children have the material basics, when they have opportunities, when they have strong and supportive relationships, there will be no child poverty. So if we could just jump to the next slide. So what can we do about child poverty? There is a lot that we can do. It's no small task, but child poverty could be ended in Australia. Sorry, Kate. No. The Hawke government reforms that I outlined earlier and our experience during COVID-19 restrictions when income supplements were in place show us that material poverty among children can be reduced, and it can be reduced quickly. So these are measures that would make a real difference immediately. They may not be enough to end multidimensional child poverty, but they would be a good start. We could just jump to the next slide. So we need a raft of measures around income and more. We do need a legislative framework that signals commitment and holds governments to account at national level, potentially also at state level. And here, a Child Poverty Reduction Act that we've already heard referred to today, or a broader legislative commitment to reducing child poverty, including child poverty, would really matter. If it's a broader commitment to reducing poverty, we have to keep child poverty at the centre because too often children simply fall away in policy agendas. We also need child poverty budget statements along the lines of the women's budget statement so we can see how money is being spent in order to reduce and ultimately end child poverty. David Tennant, star of the show, sorry, David, who you'll hear from very soon, has pointed out that children are not mentioned in our Social Security Act, but that Act shapes the lives of many children, and in some cases, actions under that Act destroy children's lives. We need to include a best interests test in that Act. And we need reform around child support. Kay Cook is in the room today and she will talk about that much more effectively than I will. So I will just keep going on. I'll leave that to Kate. And we also have the beginnings of a wellbeing framework in Australia. This is really, really exciting. This has the potential to be one of the big shifts in social policy, but it doesn't mention child poverty. It doesn't mention poverty, it hardly mentions children. We must recognise that ending child poverty is essential to scaffold wellbeing. We can never achieve wellbeing as a nation while children are living in poverty. But a child-inclusive wellbeing framework could be a really powerful tool, and we've got the beginnings. We need to reform the education system, and we need to do that in ways that are child-centred. It would take another very long presentation to tease all of this out, but it's an urgent need, as you heard from some of those quotes. This is absolutely not about teachers or even schools failing to do what's right for children. It's about a large-scale systems failure and failures that originate or failures whose origins can be traced beyond the education system itself. I'll add one thing here. One thing that always strikes me is the research that we do with children. We work with between 12 and 20 children sometimes in a group. If we have 12 children, there are normally 3 researchers in the room. 20 children will have 5 researchers in the room. I do not know how teachers work with children when they've got 28, 29, 30 children in the room. You cannot listen to children. You cannot respond to them. I take my hat off to teachers, but boy, it's a tough ask. We also need to consider child poverty impact statements to assess how policies impact on children who are living in poverty or who may fall into poverty. And this means assessing those policies not only that we normally associate with children, like education, but a broad raft of policies that impact on children's lives, like social security, as I've just mentioned, also employment and industrial relations. Poverty exists for people who are trying to survive on government benefits, but also for people who are in really low-paid, precarious work. Legislation around the labour market, around employment, around industrial relations impacts directly on children's lives, not least because of income and because of the time that they have to spend with their children. And housing and urban planning, we need child poverty assessment statements. We've already heard about the importance of social, affordable and public housing. Housing is a human right and a basic need which is not being fulfilled for way too many children. But as we build more affordable housing, indeed all housing in Australia, it must be fit for children. It must have green spaces and play areas, places for children to run, places for people to come together. If we build housing that's not fit for children, and currently that's exactly what we're doing, we will entrench disadvantage and multidimensional poverty for some children for generations to come. And that will be a policy choice. We really do need some deep reflection on the way that services from healthcare right through to emergency food services respond to children. Too often, children are simply invisible, and this is what we hear from children. We must recognise that the pressure, stress and shame that children are feeling is just as deep as that of their parents. And we do need to be aware of the impacts of a decade or more of blaming and shaming individuals and what that means for both our attitudes and our systems. And we need to challenge that. Poverty, as we've all said, is a structural problem. No child is responsible for growing up in poverty. There is a need for reform at every level, from national to local, and place-based and community initiatives have the potential to make a huge difference in children's lives and to provide children with more opportunities and stronger relationships in particular. And some of the work that we're going to be doing over the coming months will be with our partners in communities to work around how we ensure that the pieces are in place at community level and how place-based initiatives can make a difference. But we can't shift our attention from other levels, from national and state. The almost final point that I wanted to make is around the distinction that we've made in our work between being child inclusive and child-centred. Both are important, both are good. Child inclusive policy, services and practices are those that do not position children as the primary focus. Excuse me. But they do ensure that children's needs, rights and interests are recognised as a primary focus, among others, and children are identified as key stakeholders. Child-centred approaches are where policies, practice and services place children's needs, human rights and interests as the primary focus and include children as central decision makers. And here, achieving positive outcomes for children is the explicit priority. Now, we may not always want to be child-centred in our legislation, policies, services or community initiatives, or so though some will and some should be, but we should always be child inclusive, and we're a very long way from that at the moment. So I want to leave you with messages from two children, both young girls aged 10, both in primary school, both of whom have made a plea to the Prime Minister. You've heard one before, and here's a second message to the Prime Minister. And I will leave you with a message that we can act to end child poverty. We need to listen to children's experiences and refuse to ignore the pain of growing up in poverty. We need to reject narratives of blame and shame and focus instead on structural drivers and systems failures. And we need to give governments licence to act. Too often, we've allowed governments not to act. And where we can, we must act ourselves. We can end child poverty. It's challenging, but it can be done in a country as wealthy as ours. Thank you.